grabbed my wrist so suddenly that I flinched. Not hard, not threatening, but the kind of grip that comes from shock, from a body reacting before the mind catches up. He was an older man, somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired and straight-backed in a way that told you military before he ever opened his mouth. We were standing in the middle of a crowded hospital fundraiser, waiters moving around us with trays of champagne, and this man was staring at the bracelet on my wrist like he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. I pulled my arm back gently. "It was my grandfather's." He went completely still, and then something moved across his face. Not confusion, not suspicion. Recognition. Deep, aching recognition. The kind that only comes when you've been waiting a long time to see something again. "What was his name?" he asked. I told him, and the man closed his eyes. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of what happened that night makes any sense unless you understand who my grandfather was, or rather, who we thought he was. His name was Leonard Marsh. Everybody called him Len. He was 79 years old when he died, and he died exactly the way he had lived, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone paying much attention. He had worked for 31 years as a custodian at a regional post office in Dayton, Ohio. Before that, odd jobs, warehouse work, driving a delivery truck for a bread company, one brief stint at a hardware store that my father always mentioned with a particular kind of contempt, the way you mention a thing when you want to make a point. My grandfather had never owned a home. He rented a one-bedroom apartment in a beige building off Salem Avenue, the kind of place with a parking lot full of potholes and a vending machine in the lobby that was perpetually out of order. He drove a 2003 Buick with a crack in the dashboard and a passenger seat that was permanently reclined because the lever had broken years ago, and he'd never gotten around to fixing it. He was not a man anyone looked at twice. My father, his son, had spent most of his adult life quietly embarrassed by this. My dad worked in commercial real estate and wore good suits and had opinions about wine. He'd moved us from Dayton to Columbus when I was 9, and whenever he talked about his own childhood, there was always this thin layer of apology underneath it, like he was confessing to something. We saw my grandfather on holidays, Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas, and occasionally for a Sunday dinner that my mother would orchestrate with the kind of careful effort that told you it wasn't natural. My grandfather never complained about any of it. He would sit at our dining room table in his good flannel shirt, the one he saved for occasions, and eat whatever my mother made, and say, "This is very good," about everything including the things that weren't. And then he would sit in the living room afterward, and my dad would half-watch football, and my grandfather would look out the window. I was the one who would sit with him. I don't know why. I was 23 when he died, so for most of my childhood and all of my teenage years, he had just been this quiet, slightly awkward presence at the edges of our family holidays. But something in me always felt an obligation, or maybe not even obligation. Something more like gravity. Like he was pulling on me in some way I didn't understand. He never talked much, but when he did, I listened. He told me once, when I was maybe 16, that the most important thing a person could do was be reliable. Not exciting, not impressive. Reliable. Anyone can show up when it's easy, he said. The ones that matter are the ones who show up when it's hard. I wrote that down in my journal that night. I'm not sure why. It just felt like something I didn't want to lose. He got sick in the spring. Pancreatic cancer, which his doctor told him about in March and which killed him by July. He refused treatment, too old for all that, and he refused to move in with us, and he refused the home health aid my father tried to arrange twice. He wanted to stay in his apartment. He wanted to manage on his own. And so we let him. My father drove up to Dayton twice in those 4 months. My mother went once and said the apartment was depressing. I went 3 times, once with my dad, twice on my own, and I sat with him and brought him groceries, and on the last visit, in late June, I held his hand while he slept in his recliner and thought that whatever came next, I hoped it was peaceful for him. He died on a Tuesday morning in July. The building manager found him. He was in bed, which the hospice nurse who had been making twice-weekly check-ins said was a good sign. He had gone to bed and not woken up. No distress, she thought. My father drove up that afternoon, and I met him there. My mother stayed home. My aunt, my grandfather's daughter, who lived in Phoenix, called while we were at the apartment and said she couldn't get a flight until Thursday and asked if we could handle things. We said yes. There was no funeral, exactly. My grandfather had prearranged a cremation years ago and left a document in his files that said he wanted no service. My father respected this with what I can only describe as visible relief. I was the one who went back to the apartment to clear it out. My father said he'd help, but there was a deal closing that week that he couldn't reschedule. My aunt sent a check to cover the cost of a junk removal service. I told them I'd handle it myself. I don't know why I said that. I just wasn't ready for the apartment to be emptied by strangers. It took me 2 weekends. My grandfather had not been a collector. There wasn't much to sort through. Some clothes, a small television, kitchen things, a shelf of paperback westerns, and one shelf of history books that were so worn the spines had gone soft. I donated most of it. I kept the history books. And I kept the bracelet. I found it in the bottom drawer of his dresser, inside an old tobacco tin that had no tobacco in it. The bracelet was the only thing in the tin. It was plain silver, not sterling, I didn't think. Just silver-colored metal, and it was a simple chain with a flat rectangular tag on it, the kind you might expect to be engraved with a name or blood type. But the tag was blank on both sides, no engraving, no markings at all. I turned it over and over in my hands for a long time. My grandfather had not been a jewelry person. He wore a watch, a digital Casio that he'd had for probably 20 years, and a plain ring on his right hand that he'd never explained and that I'd always assumed was a remnant of something he never talked about. But this bracelet was different. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't random. It had the feeling of something deliberate, something kept. I put it in my pocket. I didn't tell my father about it. Later, at home in Columbus, I put it on. It fit well on my wrist, which felt strange. My grandfather's wrist had been larger than mine, but somehow it sat right. I wore it most days after that without thinking much about it. The way you sometimes absorb a piece of someone after they're gone without meaning to. Like you're carrying a small piece of them with you. My parents never asked about it. I don't know if they ever noticed. It was November when I ended up at the fundraiser. I worked in nonprofit communications. I still do. And my organization was one of the co-sponsors of an annual gala for a hospital foundation in Columbus. It was the kind of event I would normally skip if I could. Ballroom, past appetizers, people in cocktail attire, making conversation that was 70% professional networking and 30% genuine. But I was junior enough that attendance wasn't optional. I'd been standing near the edge of the room, talking to a colleague about nothing in particular, when I felt someone step up beside me. I turned slightly, the way you do when you sense someone in your peripheral field. He was tall. Still tall, even with the slight forward bend of a man in his late 60s who has learned to carry something heavy. Silver hair cut short and clean. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, a small pin on his lapel that I didn't recognize. He was looking at a plaque on the nearby wall and not looking at me at all. Then he glanced over, the way you do, and his eyes dropped to my wrist. And stopped. I noticed because his whole body changed, not dramatically. He didn't gasp, didn't make a sound, but there was this sudden quality of stillness, like a man who has just heard a noise he didn't expect in a dark house. He went very, very still. "Excuse me," he said. I looked at him. "That bracelet," he nodded toward my wrist. "Where did you get it?" I was careful the way a woman alone in a room full of strangers is careful. It belonged to my grandfather. He passed away this summer. Something moved across his face. What was his name? I hesitated. Then I told him. He closed his eyes. It was only for a second, but in that second I saw something that looked like grief. Old grief. The kind that's been sitting in a person for a long time and knows how to wait. "Leonard Marsh," he said quietly, not asking, confirming. "You knew him?" He opened his eyes and looked at me directly then. "Yes," he said. "I knew him a long time ago." He paused. "My name is Arthur Blythe. I was an Army intelligence officer. I retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2011. I waited. "Is there somewhere we could sit down?" he asked. "What I have to tell you. It's going to take a few minutes, and you should probably hear it." We found a table in the corner of the room, away from most of the crowd. A waiter stopped and offered us drinks. And Arthur Blythe said, "Water, please, thank you." And then he sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at me for a moment like he was deciding where to start. Your grandfather, he said, was not just a post office custodian. I didn't say anything. He was a custodian. That part is true. But for 31 years, Leonard Marsh was also an asset of a small, quiet program under the Defense Intelligence Agency. He reported to a handler, which was me, for the last 14 of those years. His assignment was to flag, catalog, and occasionally intercept materials passing through that postal facility that were of interest to an ongoing counterintelligence operation. The room was loud around us. I heard it very distantly. I need to understand what you're saying, I said. Arthur Blythe nodded. Your grandfather was a civilian intelligence asset, what people sometimes call an informant, though that word has connotations that don't quite fit. He wasn't reporting on neighbors or friends. He was part of a specific operational framework targeting the movement of documents and materials related to a foreign intelligence network that was using commercial mail channels. He paused. I realize that probably sounds like something out of a movie. It does, I said. It was very real. He looked at the bracelet on my wrist. That bracelet was an identifier. Assets in the program were given them in the early years, before digital verification, when physical identifiers were still standard practice. Your grandfather received his when he was recruited in 1981. He was 38 years old. He had served 2 years in the Army before a medical discharge. Nothing serious, a knee injury, and he had a particular skill set that made him useful. He was observant. He was methodical. He had no apparent profile, no college degree, no professional network, nothing that would make anyone look at him twice. Arthur Blythe paused. That was not a flaw. That was the asset. I looked down at the bracelet, the flat silver tag, blank on both sides. He never told anyone? I asked. That was a condition of participation. His cover was absolute. No family members, no close friends. The program operated on compartmentalization. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was, including him. For 31 years, I said. For 31 years. I sat with that for a moment. 31 years of going to work at a building that everyone around him probably considered a dead-end job. 31 years of being the man my father was quietly embarrassed by. 31 years of flannel shirts and the broken recliner seat and the Casio watch, and the paperback westerns and the Sunday dinners where he looked out the window while the football game played. Was he paid? I asked. Yes. A separate account managed through a cutout. The compensation was modest. This was never a lucrative arrangement, but he received a structured payment over 31 years, and there was a provision for post-service benefits. He paused. Are you aware of any account or financial holdings beyond what would have been typical for someone on a custodian's salary? I shook my head. Arthur Blythe nodded slowly. He may have arranged it as inheritance, or he may not have touched it. Some of them didn't. It became a kind of... He stopped. It became part of the identity, I think. Living as the person your cover said you were. After long enough, some of them forgot how to think of themselves any other way. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his beige apartment off Salem Avenue. I thought about the paperback westerns on the shelf, and the Casio watch, and the way he always said, "This is very good about everything." Did he do good work? I asked. It was a strange question. I didn't plan to ask it. It just came out. Arthur Blythe looked at me for a long moment before he answered. Yes, he said, he did. In 1994, a cache of materials he flagged led to an interdiction that our analysts believed prevented the compromise of a signals intelligence source that would have had significant downstream consequences. I can't give you details, some of this remains classified, but I can tell you that within the program, that event was considered significant. The people who knew about it considered Leonard Marsh's contribution essential. He paused again. He never knew that. We couldn't tell him. Operational security. I looked at the bracelet. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Because he's gone, Arthur Blythe said. And because you're wearing that bracelet, which means he kept it, he didn't have to. Assets were encouraged to surrender identifiers when the program restructured in the mid-2000s. He didn't. He kept it. He glanced at it again. I think he wanted someone to know. Someday. I think he kept it for that reason. He reached inside his jacket and produced a small card. Plain, cream-colored, with just a phone number handwritten on the back. There are things I'm still not able to tell you, but there are things I can tell you through proper channels if you want to pursue it. There's a process. It takes time. But if you want documentation, something you can hold, it's possible to request a declassified record. I took the card. My hand was very steady, which surprised me. I felt like it should have been shaking. My grandfather, I said slowly, died in a one-bedroom apartment. My father drove up twice while he was sick. We had a cremation with no service. I stopped. He spent 31 years doing what you're describing, and we didn't know any of it. We never asked. We just assumed we knew who he was. Arthur Blythe didn't say anything. He was the most reliable person I knew, I said. He told me once. I stopped, then made myself continue. He told me that the most important thing was being reliable, showing up when it was hard. Arthur Blythe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds exactly right." I called my father that night from the parking garage after the event. I was sitting in my car with the bracelet in my palm, and I told him everything Arthur Blythe had told me. My father was quiet for a long time. I heard him set something down. A glass, maybe. Then I heard him breathe out. "I didn't know," he said. "I know." I never asked him much about. He stopped. He never talked about himself. I just thought he didn't have much to say. Dad. "I know," my father said. His voice was different, lower. "I know." We drove to Dayton the following Saturday, my father and me. There was no specific reason to go. My grandfather was gone, the apartment had been cleared, there was nothing physical left of him in that city. But my father wanted to go, and I think I understood why. So I drove and he sat in the passenger seat and we didn't talk much for the first hour. We stopped at a diner on the north side of Dayton that my grandfather had liked. My father remembered him mentioning it once, years ago, and looked it up the night before. It was still there. We sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee and pie neither of us finished, and my father told me things he'd never told me before. He told me about being 11 years old and his father taking him to a Cincinnati Reds game, driving 2 hours each way, and how they listened to baseball on the drive home, because the radio in the car was better than the seats they'd had. He told me about how his father had shown up, unannounced, to his college graduation. My father had told him not to bother, not to make the drive, it would be boring, and how he'd spotted him in the crowd in the same flannel shirt, standing completely still, watching. He told me that he had spent 30 years being embarrassed about where he came from when he should have been. He stopped. "I just didn't look," he said. That's it. I had already decided who he was, so I stopped looking. We drove past the post office on the way back to the highway. Neither of us suggested it. I just turned that way and my father didn't say anything. And we drove slowly past the building, a flat brown building on a flat brown street, completely ordinary in every way. My grandfather had walked in and out of that building for 31 years. He had done something important there, and it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. I think that was the point. I pursued the declassification process Arthur Blythe described, which took 8 months and involved more paperwork than I have ever completed in my life for anything. My aunt in Phoenix, when I told her, cried and said she'd always felt guilty for moving so far away. My father requested a copy of every document I received. The record that came back was partial, significant sections still redacted, but there was enough. Leonard Marsh, civilian asset, program identifier, dates of service, a summary of contributions that used language that was formal and bureaucratic and careful, and still, somehow, unmistakable. Assets contributions are assessed as consequential to operational objectives during the relevant period. That sentence. I read it probably 40 times. My father had it framed. It sits now in his office, next to his college degree and a photograph of our family from when I was about 10 years old. There's a photograph in that picture of my grandfather at one of those Thanksgiving dinners. Not the framed one, a different one I found in a box at my parents' house. He is sitting at the end of the table, slightly apart from everyone else, holding a glass of water because he didn't drink. He is looking at the camera. He is not smiling exactly, but there is something around his eyes that I never noticed when I was young. Something calm and settled, like a man who knows exactly who he is and has decided it's enough. I wear the bracelet every day. I have looked up the history of the program Arthur Blythe described, the public portions, what's been declassified over the years, and I understand now more than I did that night in the ballroom. I understand that there are people who hold things together quietly, without recognition, without anyone knowing to say thank you. People whose whole contribution is invisible by design. My grandfather was one of those people. He showed up when it was hard, for 31 years. In a building nobody looked at twice. Doing a job nobody asked questions about, carrying something he couldn't tell anyone. I'm asking the questions now. I'm telling it now. He deserves someone to know. I've thought a lot about what my grandfather said to me when I was 16, that the most important thing a person could do was be reliable. Not impressive, not loud, reliable. I wrote it down that same night, and I didn't fully understand why, until I was sitting in a parking garage in November, holding a plain silver bracelet, replaying a conversation with a man named Arthur Blythe, who had just turned everything I thought I knew inside out. My grandfather didn't fail at life. He chose a life that looked like failure from the outside because the work required it. That distinction took me a long time to sit with, and I think it's the most important thing I've carried out of all of this. We make judgments about people based on what we can see. The apartment, the car, the job title, the flannel shirt worn to every occasion. We decide we already know someone, and then we stop looking. My father said it exactly right at that diner table in Dayton. He had already decided who his father was, so he stopped looking. That's not cruelty. That's something quieter and more common and in some ways harder to fix than cruelty. It's just not paying attention. Leonard Marsh paid attention for 31 years. To every piece of mail that moved through that facility, to every pattern and anomaly, to the kind of careful, methodical observation that most people abandon because it isn't rewarded visibly. Nobody gave him a plaque. Nobody gave him a dinner. He drove home in his 2003 Buick with the broken seat, and he kept going back year after year because he had made a commitment, and he understood that commitments mean more when they're inconvenient than when they're easy. That's not a small thing. That's everything, actually. That's the whole shape of a life that holds. I think about the people around him who saw a quiet man going nowhere and felt confirmed in their assumptions. And I think about what it takes to live inside someone else's assumptions about you for decades without either collapsing under them or needing to correct them. That requires something most of us don't develop because we're never asked to. A sense of self so settled and interior that outside recognition becomes genuinely beside the point. My grandfather had that. I don't know when he built it or what it cost him, but he had it. What I want to carry forward from this, what I think he was telling me, in that one sentence about reliability, in the bracelet he kept instead of surrendering, is that character is not what happens when people are watching. It's what you do in the building nobody looks at twice, on the Tuesday morning when it's cold and tedious and there's no acknowledgement coming. Integrity is that. Perseverance is that. The wisdom to understand that your contribution matters even when, especially when, no one around you knows enough to say so. I wear the bracelet every day, not as a symbol of anything grand, just as a reminder that I didn't really know him, and I should have looked harder. And it is not too late to look harder at a people still here. He showed up when it was hard. That's what I want to do with what he left me.